have
Yeah.
we developed questions that we ask of every single candidate so that we
Mhm.
can actually measure something in the interview process that we can help that will help us make a decision, right? Because if
Mhm.
we don't have any sort of plan and everybody's asking different questions, nobody's aligned on what we actually need, who knows what we're going to end up with at the end. And sometimes it works out and that's
Yeah.
great. And a lot of times it doesn't, but it takes a while to figure out where the actual problem is, right?
All right. I'm excited to roll us into another episode of Lead for Performance and thrilled to welcome Suzanne Crettol today, who is a fractional talent acquisition executive. Welcome to the podcast, Suzanne.
Thanks, Sandra. I appreciate you inviting me to join.
Yes, absolutely. So I am so excited to pick your brain on performance and leadership and what it really takes to build it and sustain it in the real world. So let's just jump in. You're working with multiple and mostly startups, if I
Mhm.
recall correctly. So I just wonder from your unique perspective of kind of being in the company, but also having that outside perspective, what patterns are you seeing right now with how the companies are approaching talent and leadership development?
Oh, those are really good questions. It depends on the stage of the organization.
Hmm.
Smaller organizations will have not a lot in place, right? There's not a lot of
Yeah.
foundational things. The little more progressive startups or ones that are really focused on growth and expanding from a headcount perspective as well will have more in place or at least be working towards putting more in place. But what I can tell you from a talent acquisition side is not having anything in place can really be very challenging and getting the talent in the door. Everybody tells me all the time, I don't care what size of the company, we have a high bar for hiring. And I'm always like, great, what do you have in place to support that? And the answer is not always, well, we don't have anything. Like, we don't need it, or we're going to worry about that later. And that's okay. Like, I can still find people that are open to that and can thrive in an environment that doesn't have any foundational support, but it does make my job harder.
Yeah. And what should be, what is it that should scare organizations into putting in those foundational pieces into place?
That's
Not
a
that we want to scare
good,
them, but that helps sometimes.
yeah. I think, to be honest, they don't understand. They don't have awareness for the
Yeah.
most part because they aren't asking their people where the challenges are. They don't have any sort of way of capturing signals other
Mhm.
than the obvious turnover problem. Like if you're having a lot of turnover in a role, you have to do a deep dive to figure out why. It's usually a shared responsibility between the people you're bringing in and the people that are executing the interview plan. Like, what are we missing in that cycle? Right. And to figure that out. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is, most people have some sort of HRIS system. Right. Because you have to capture, especially if you are hiring people on your own entity versus like a PEO or something. You have an HRIS system that can send surveys, or even some applicant tracking systems can send surveys to employees, like Ashby's one of those. And you can send signals or you can receive signals by the way people are answering the questions. You can
Mhm.
also notice it in meetings. Is everybody open to raising their hands? Are they talking, or is everybody just really quiet? That's another signal you have to pay attention to when you're
Yeah.
thinking about what's happening inside an org. I find that at startups, especially with first time founders, they aren't always thinking about that or they always recognizing it, nor is the rest of the leadership team either. It's so fast. You're moving at light speed. And I mean, it can be hard to stop, you know, take a
Yeah.
moment to pay attention in a meeting or anything like that until it's too late.
Yeah, that's really a great point to highlight. That's actually been one of the themes that's emerged from all these conversations is this, in the world of noise that we live in today, top skill is hearing, like sorting the noise into a signal. Like, what is a signal that really matters to me, right? So, and I love that you're talking about that. It's great to have. You can imagine that that's a value that you're bringing to the organizations. But can you share some of the signals that you see that are often being missed when as founders, especially in the startup environment, are so laser focused on business results?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right about business rules. And that's okay. That's understanding, right? You are
Yeah.
completely just trying to make it in a broad world sometimes. Signals that founders can look at besides what I already mentioned, like, are we running a clear interview? Right? Like, have
Mhm.
we developed questions that we ask of every single candidate so that we
Mhm.
can actually measure something in the interview process that we can help that will help us make a decision, right? Because if
Mhm.
we don't have any sort of plan and everybody's asking different questions, nobody's aligned on what we actually need, who knows what we're going to end up with at the end. And sometimes it works out and that's
Yeah.
great. And a lot of times it doesn't, but it takes a while to figure out where the actual problem is, right? So that's one area in interviewing that I'd say is a really important thing. Put a structured interview in place sooner
Mhm.
rather than later because it's really helpful. It's expensive to hire and it's
Yes.
expensive to have candidates not worked out. And not to mention, it hurts your brand,
Yeah.
right? Because that person that isn't working out is going to be upset and rightfully so. And if we all do a little more work on the front end, we'll have better outcomes on the back end, right?
Yeah.
And then other things that I see are challenging are not having like career architecture in place, not showing a growth
Mhm.
path for internal employees. And that can be hard. They're really small. And I think overall, we're all going to have more challenges with that if we're going to have fewer people inside organizations. I mean,
Yes.
AI is changing the way we work, and that's wonderful. But we do have to think through some of these things and realize the repercussions of not having certain things like career progression, very laid out, a lot of levels, all that thing, so people know and can map out their trajectory.
Mhm.
So it will impact your ability to attract talent. It will impact our ability to retain talent. And then, of course, getting the compensation right with all those variables is super important as well. And
Yeah.
staying competitive, knowing what your competitors are doing and ensuring you're taking that into consideration as well. It's a lot of work.
Yes. And this is also one of those things that comes up, right? It's like it's often drawing these conversations are helpful to draw our attention to the investments that are make you make up front that pay off in the back, right? Often.
Mhm.
But of course that's always it's such a tough thing to do
Well, it
to
is because
invest.
you have to
Yes.
slow down,
Yes. You have
right?
to slow
Like you
down. Imagine
can't.
that.
But
Yeah.
nobody can slow down in a
Yeah.
startup, and I
Yeah.
respect that, but if I can get them to understand that, which I typically do, by the way, normally they bring me in when they've already gone through,
Yeah.
some problems and they recognize that they need someone with a different level of expertise to come in and help.
Yeah.
That's typically when they bring me in. I don't think I've ever walked into a situation where there have been some sort of trouble where, like, I do, so it's too bad that that happens, but it is the reality of kind of the normal
Yeah,
process.
of course. And then, so that I know you're obviously, I have to ask you as part of this, thriving startup community, it's not just about the getting the right people in the door. That's one way, but then also
Mhm.
how do you keep them, right? So it turns to retention, which of course startups are notorious for, the high performance, complex challenges come and, take people into burnout mode. So
Yeah.
that's also certainly as a huge high cost on the back end. So I would just love to pick your brain and get your thoughts on, how do you how do you help organizations, make those good new hires land, succeed, and stay into the longer term, not just for, a couple of sprints.
That's a really hard one.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know that I've found a way that works every time.
Yeah.
Um, I think that imparting, like ensuring that we can measure for those signals. I always lead with data. That's my
Yeah.
go-to because, I work in tech. So typically
Right. Yeah.
I'm working with a founder who has a tech background. They really rely
Mm.
on data. And frankly, my first career, I used a lot of data. So it's something that I'm very comfortable with as well. And we all kind of trust that anyway. We don't want to go on a gut feeling. We want to use data to impart our decision making process. And then I just use like the wonderful resources that we have available. McKinsey puts out really good information
Yeah.
on these areas that I use. There's just a lot of data on why startups fail or why they have challenges.
Yeah.
So for a new, revised, more recent type of information, and I will use that to help create awareness around what I'm trying to drive to ensure that, we can focus on what's important. However, all that good intention, the most important thing that drives companies to change is people dropping out, the
Mm,
turnover. That is the biggest indicator for companies to really impart change. I don't see it happen as often, especially with American companies. I think the broader global companies sometimes do it a little better than we do. And there are certainly some countries that are just as hard as us as well, or even more challenging. But I'll give you an example. I was talking to an Australian company and they just seem like they really, while everybody's still flying the plane while building it, right? That's the normal startup mentality. They seem to have a lot more work life balance in place. And that's an important initiative for them.
yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Yeah, helpful to hear. Do you? There's a kind of I've come to realize that there's kind of this. There's a individual side, like individual. We
Oh,
each as
sure.
individuals have a role to play in our own sustainability of performance, but there's also this systemic organizational factors that help and influence that, right? So of course that's what probably leads to the it depends answer that you started with, right? Because it's always going to be this balance to
Yeah,
play.
and you make a really good point. Like we have to take some of the responsibility for that as
Mhm.
individuals. That's important. And there's little things that you can do. There's little software that's free that you can add on to your calendars that will allow for, a break 10 minutes before any meeting or 30 minutes after. I use that because I need time after my meeting to
Yeah.
recap or to digest what I heard, things like that. And I've worked inside organizations that created like culture champion clubs or culture clubs where people are sharing information. Each group might, and in this particular instance, work life balance, might share at an all hands meeting about
Yeah.
some of the ways that they protect their time and how they handle. Those things are really helpful because, especially if you're really young and you haven't had exposure or experience working in a larger corporate environment, it's very exciting. And in a remote environment, right? It's even harder because your computer's always on. How do
Yeah.
I step away from my computer and make sure that I'm taking care of myself? Because it's very easy to get lost
Yeah.
at home and not step away. Like
Yeah.
that is for sure something that you have to impart on yourself. And but there is a balance.
There's a
If you're
balance. Yeah.
too boundary focused, a manager might feel that you're just not a fit because you're not willing to do the work or be part of the grind, which there is a grind in startups. I mean, that's just a fact.
Yeah, actually, I saw. I think in some one of your one of as I was researching and looking up into some of your statements, I think you saw that it's almost that you said something like it's inevitable that it'll happen, and I
Oh,
thought,
it
oh,
is.
that yes,
Sometimes you have to put in the extra hours, right? Like
yeah,
I've recruited in the UK. I
hmm
can't keep my hours 9 to 5 Pacific
mm,
in order to do that, right? Like my day changes. My calendar is open.
yeah,
If I'm recruiting in the UK or Europe, my calendar's a lot bigger, but normally I keep it 7 to 7. So
mm,
12 hours. I'm not working all 12 hours, but if somebody puts time on my calendar at 7 a.m., then I'm probably going to have a shorter day that day, or
yeah,
I
and in
might
that
step
case,
away a little bit.
yeah, and that's a good example of where it's up to the individual too, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not the problem of the client, right? They're just living their life
Mm.
in their time zone, right?
Yeah.
But it puts the onus on the individual again to really understand their needs and put some of those boundaries and find a way to make it work within in the system and the constraints that really exist. It goes both
Right.
ways.
Now, what I find too that's really important in that with setting boundaries is communication.
Yes,
Don't
of
just
course.
set them and not communicate because then somebody might make up their own narrative about why you're doing that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the communication piece is really important, whether it's during the interview process or you find yourself burning out and you've been with the company for 2 years, you put on the one-on-one doc with your manager that you really want to talk through how you can work together to find a new system. You can present an idea, a solution, right? We don't just want to complain. Every time you just complain without a solution, it's always a negative impact on you. You
Yeah.
want to come with a solution to the problem that you want to discuss and find a way to work together.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes no, obviously makes a lot of sense. That's great. Now, all right, so I want to ask you because you're working, building pipelines for organizations, right? And
Mhm.
getting that, internal and external. Now, there's a lot that can happen, and I bet it more, sorry, it's very prevalent in startups as well, is kind of hiring or promoting on a hunch or a gut feeling. And I've
Mhm.
certainly worked and experienced where, situations where this prevails. And I would just, and I, we already talked about data being such an important tool for you when you're using this. So I would just wonder, how do you balance the two? And do you have some good or bad examples or where hunches, build or kill the pipeline? And how does you balance that?
Yeah, it's really hard because I hire every day. I interview every single day. That's
Yeah.
my job, my entire function. So for me, it's very easy to see it, right? Because that's all I do.
Okay.
And what I find is there can be very experienced hiring managers that don't have awareness around how they're coming off, what they're doing, how they because they're so accustomed to hire. I've hired well in the past. Well,
Yeah.
that's great. I appreciate that. However, I do have a list of resources that honestly, there's this huge research study that I use. I can send it to you if you want to put it in comments or something. But
Yeah.
it's from like the 1960s. That's how far back it goes to show the value of structured interview processes
Okay.
and why it's important. But that also tells you that it's crazy that we're still having these conversations here in 2026 when the research was already there.
Oh my God, we can talk about that for sure. I would actually love to see this, and please, yes, send. We're happy. I always like to highlight these, what I call these like basics or fundamentals that are standing the test of time. And it kills me when we have so much proof, decades, how we are not, listening to ourselves, our own data, the proof that we have, right? Like, so, why? Why do you think this is still so, why is this going to be news for people to read this that's been around for like 60 years now?
I know. Well, I think that most people don't get very structured interview training,
Right.
especially in startups, right? And anytime you train someone in anything, it takes multiple touch points. You have to reinforce
Yeah.
it as you go through, right? And and if you don't have the support, like say you don't have an HR team, maybe I'm the
Right.
only one there. That makes it a little more challenging. So I try to
Yeah.
remind people as I go through respectfully, of course, but I can't control because I'm not an internal employee.
Right.
However, I have been an internal talent acquisition leader and I really used my team, myself. We constantly have to reinforce this. I used our HR team to help with that as well as as a way to do it. And I got everybody on board and it was fantastic. We could show the results. We can pull data from the applicant tracking system that shows the funnel and where people are dropping off and where we're being successful and why this is important. So it's not enough to just collect data. You have to talk about it and you have to do it continually. And you
Yeah.
have to show your appreciation for the team that are really pitching in, right? Like it's just part of it. Change management is a huge part of what I do because I am asking them to do something different, right?
Yeah.
And everybody says like we have to avoid the gut feeling. Well, what does that mean, right? Like what if you're not interviewing every day, do you really know what that means
Yeah.
completely? Like, do you know what that means to you?
Yeah.
Because you might have a different bias than someone else. There's hundreds of biases, right?
Yeah.
I know what mine are. And I have awareness about that. And I try to very impart that on people and teach them. I always remind them if you start feeling a visceral reaction to a comment somebody makes or you feel something, that's an indicator. That should tell you right there that you might have a bias about something. So be aware of that and start thinking about it. So it's all challenging, but the reinforcement is ultra important.
Yeah, I love it to hear yeah, I mean, structure, I believe deeply in structure. And I think it's with expertise comes the ability to know what needs to be structured and where to leave room for flexibility and personality, values, mission, purpose, etc. So it's really cool to hear you talk about that also in this, very specific function of the business. So, to me, it continues that structure really reinforces so many different functions across the organization. Takes
Yeah,
knowledge
but
and expertise.
even
Yeah.
even when you put it in place, though, you'll start having conversations with other
Yeah.
interviewers, and then you might figure out they aren't doing it. And it's so it's constant, right? Like it's just
Yeah,
one day at a
absolutely.
time.
Totally. I want to ask you because I know you've had significant success with DE&I strategies, particularly with gender diversity hires. Now, I've always been really passionate about women in tech. And then, with professional women in general as well. And, it's almost gone out of fashion, let's say, the last few years to talk about that. but you're still highlighting some really impressive numbers. So I just really want to talk to you a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, is it like the day now where it's almost, harder to talk about it sometimes? You're still, how are you still succeeding with it? And what are the biggest kind of like what would you highlight to the leaders today still about the power of focusing on this type of this aspect of hiring?
Yeah, it goes back to wanting to be able to attract the best. If you want to be able to attract the best, you have to open that up to everyone, right?
Yeah.
And when I had that success, I was internal at an organization. And what I did when I first got there was started looking at the data. I
Mm,
couldn't use the data, it wasn't clean. So I had to fix the SLAs to make sure that we could get the data where it was actionable, right? So
yeah.
that was my first focus. I did install new technology. So
Mhm.
at the time, we were using Gem, which has really good functionality. So we can look at our
Yeah.
data. That data was good. So I could use that right away. I just couldn't use the applicant tracking system data.
Mhm.
So I imparted it on my team to make sure we were providing a more even pipeline. If
Mm.
we have 90% male, then that's not going to be good, right? We have to have awareness around creating a better pipeline, not because we don't want the best person through, because we want that. We want the best person
Mhm.
to come through. But we want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to go through.
Yeah.
And then I just started openly talking about it, right? It's again just creating awareness. I don't think anybody has the intention of excluding anyone. I really don't.
Mhm.
I have not seen that
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah. Fair. Yeah.
When you bring it to their attention, then all of a sudden it becomes, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize, or I didn't know we didn't have enough women in the pipeline, or I didn't
Mm.
know we have enough people of color in the pipeline.
Mhm.
And if you can't measure it, it's really hard to do that, right? And so measuring helped, having open discussions about it helped a lot. And I was just honest. I imparted my team on being really honest. I was really honest. I
Yeah.
had quite a few women say something to me about not having leadership in females in leadership positions. And I said, I understand. I need somebody to be the first. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's okay. If it's not for you, I understand. I respect that. I'm not here to talk you into anything. But if you're open to having conversations with the team, and I encourage you to be transparent about what's important to you, and have these open conversations, and I did prep the team to be ready for those things, then that's how we moved the needle. I needed
Yeah.
somebody to be the first. And then as we started getting more females into the organization, then I could create more diversity on the interview groups, right? If
Mm.
all I had were men, because I did have a few women comment about the fact, hey, why are all the interview panels men? And it's a fair question. And so as we got more women into the organization, we were able to diversify the interview panel as well. So it was more diverse, so to
Yeah.
speak, and representative. And so we just went from that way, and then the results just took off. And it was
Okay.
really important because our clients
Mhm.
also ask from us, especially B Corp clients, they expect you to show your diversity rankings, like
Yeah.
how you've improved and all that.
No,
So
very
then we started
interesting.
having metrics, and it also helped the RFP process because they could make decisions. It's not the leading deciding factor, of course, but
Yeah.
they can make decisions whether or not to go with you as a service provider based on
Yeah.
your statistics as well.
No, that's really great to hear that that your take on this from working from the inside to see that it's yeah, it's alive and well. The will is there, and it's really about showing and then that's the way to open the doors for this is really again to use data, and it's resonating.
Mhm.
That feels reassuring.
Yeah.
What's your experience with kind of when you work with organizations and they're faced with this kind of internal versus external leadership pipeline building? From the data perspective and again, of course, your experience, what makes how does an organization decide really to either develop leaders internally or to hire externally? What really drives that kind of decision and consideration?
It's a tough one. I
Mhm.
find mostly they go external,
Okay.
and because there is no learning and development
Oh,
internal. There's always an exception of that person that is just, a go-getter. They figure everything out. They're
yeah,
a very high performer. And excuse me. And they will be visible to the leadership, and they will continue to move up.
yeah.
Where I had a founder. he just wouldn't promote anybody.
Hmm.
Nobody always went external, always felt that the gap was too big
Mm.
to bring somebody from internal. I have seen some HR leaders get in there and really work with specific high performers to try and get them to the next level. But I can tell you, and I was not involved, but seeing it on the sidelines, it was painful.
Yeah, it can be for sure. But then it kind of goes with that challenge that we kind of brought up at the beginning, right? Having that kind of development or, or I like how you call it career architecture.
Mhm.
So, that kind of closes down the path on the architecture. Like, so it's always, but I bet it's always, it's in trade-offs, right? Like the trade-off for the,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
well, I can tell you what I did with lower level
Yeah.
roles. Because what I used to do is I would meet with the different leaders once a week to talk about what's changing, what's different, because I always wanted to get ahead on the
Yeah.
pipeline of whatever they were thinking about.
Yeah.
Right. And so, what I would constantly do, I just made sure I knew every single person that worked under them. I read their performance reviews. I talked
Okay.
with them, their managers about it, and I knew all their skill sets because I knew the business really well.
Mm.
So that's the other thing I do with talent acquisition. I work backwards from the business problems that we're trying to solve with each hire and what we're moving towards. So I can have a better understanding of our talent we need, where the gaps might be. Because in hiring, you should always hire for the gaps, right? Like we don't want everybody to be perfect when they walk in the door because where are they going to go? They're going to expect a promotion really quick. And that's just easy for somebody like me to see that they're really ready for the next level and then just go after them and say, hey, I know
Yeah.
you're an associate director, but I have a senior director at another role and I think you're a great fit for it. That's how I get people all the time. So if you hire too high and you do that all the time, you're very vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's worth punching out the point you said they're always leading with the business. That actually not always. That's makes sense and should always be in there. But I've seen many times where acquisition function, even HR function, even leadership development function are actually not directly embedded into the business value chain. They are seen as kind of like these external or characteristics or skills that somehow magically the person's supposed to put into action to work for the business. So I think that that's a really great point worth punctuating there.
Well, I appreciate that. And frankly, a lot of recruiters didn't start out as a recruiter. I didn't. I was an operator, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I always looked at it from the business sense when I
Yeah.
started recruiting because I'm a salesperson. I have to sell two people. I have to sell the
Right.
candidate on an opportunity, and I have to sell the
Yeah.
company on the candidate as well, and why I think. So if I know what their plan is for the next 6 to 12 months, and all of a sudden I'm talking to somebody and they tell me something that we're not even looking for, but it aligns with the business strategy, that gets me really excited because then there's even better fit and
Yeah.
something we didn't even consider. So being open and flexible when you find that talent that can really help move the needle in a way you didn't even consider before is something that I think is really important too. But
Yeah. No. Yeah.
yeah, I typically walk in as a business partner. I'm not walking in
Yeah.
as just a recruiter.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That probably speaks to a lot of your success there. But I also say, I feel like, do you feel like it's the influence you have in these organizations when you're working to help? Just going back to something else you said, to kind of see that the gap is so large. From, let's say you're hiring individual
Mhm,
contributors to do a
mhm.
certain job, right? And then there's a need opens up for a manager or something like that, and then you're saying with such clarity they see it's such a huge gap, so we hire out. Well, actually, the theme that I've heard or I've seen actually more happen is that they just assume the individual contributor will be a good manager. So they hire under because they want to, promote within, or there's all these arguments, they understand the culture, they've been here, or they're very charismatic, or I like them, or these terrible things. So
Mhm.
it's like, I wonder if this, infusion of an external experience, a business centric recruiter actually makes it more clear that this gap is bigger than it big and you don't have the internal capability to close it. So I just wonder if you see that as a really benefit that you're bringing to the organization.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not shy. I will lay it out as long as I have all the information and typically people share everything with me. I develop good relationships and Unfortunately, I have a really good reputation in the industry. I've been doing the same type of industry for quite a long time. So it might have been a little more challenging in the beginning stages of my transition to
Yeah,
recruiting, but I don't really have that problem anymore. I do have trust and experience, which is certainly very helpful. But I still have to, come in and learn before I can just walk in and say that, right? Like
yeah,
I don't
yes,
yeah, like, I can't just wave a magic wand and say, "Yes, that person is ready to go," because more than likely they're not. Let's be honest,
yeah,
what you said is very valid,
yeah,
and I've certainly seen that as well, but
yeah,
that's, again, somewhere that we can take some personal responsibility. Let's
yeah,
start planning for that, right? Okay, so maybe I'm not gonna get trained as a manager, but, I do have awareness about what's working in my
yeah,
one-on-one with the manager. I can also there's a ton of information on the internet. I mean, ChatGPT does a great job with telling you all this stuff on how you can start transitioning yourself into more responsibility. And a lot of times, if you just ask or you start taking on other challenges or showing how you're effectively preparing for the next phase, that starts awareness, right? That starts a
yeah,
conversation. So then when you do have to slow down, when you do have to start thinking about, do I want to promote or do I want to go external? My
yeah,
gosh, I've got, Sandra over here who did an amazing job talking
yeah.
about how she's preparing for the next phase. We should give her a shot.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense, and then it becomes almost inevitable path forward.
Yeah.
It just makes sense because you're already on it, right? You're not it's not this, like, superficial layer or big risk, taken by the business. Yeah, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. That's really good advice. I wonder if you've seen a pattern where, again, rightfully so, let's say, startup is building up, they have awareness that they can't build leaders, so they're externally hiring for key positions. Now, is there a kind of an inflection point at which it does make sense to start building in internal learning and development plans? Depending on whatever the business is. Is there some sort of a pattern that you see across organizations where you're like, it's either a signal, a size, or something specific about them that really tells you, okay, it's time to really consider not just working with me, but also, expanding some sort of internal development.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll tell you why that's hard to answer.
Mhm.
Because organizations, that is typically the last thing that they add, learning and development.
Yeah, fair. Yeah.
And the other thing they do is most founders take what they're comfortable with and what they know, what they've been exposed to, and
Yeah.
they impart that into their processes as a starting point, right?
Mm.
However, and I'll give you an example because I've worked with a lot of founders that worked at Amazon. Amazon has wonderful, very thoughtful ways of doing things. You might have a 9 box for performance reviews, or you might have a very detailed structure and case study plan for an interview process, but you try to put all that into a small company, that is overwhelming. And
Yeah.
you are not
Yes.
executing.
Yeah.
Then you think that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, but you're not actually capturing the
Mm.
real signals and the real information that you need to make informed decisions, because it's way too broad, it's way too big, it's too many things, and your company is not ready
Yeah.
for that level of sophistication. So instead of, taking something we're familiar with, let's go ahead and start there. That's fine. I don't have a problem with
Yeah.
that. Let's filter some of that out. Let's
Yeah.
keep what's really important for our stage
Yeah.
and areas that we know we can execute on, because otherwise it gets really overwhelming. Like I
Yeah.
see nothing but everybody wanting to throw away performance reviews now. I see that constantly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a very noisy thing on LinkedIn, and I actually don't think it's a bad idea. And I'll tell you why. When I had my own team, when I had direct reports, I like to talk to them very clearly about what they're doing really well and areas that I want them to work on at every one-on-one, if
Mhm.
necessary.
Mm.
So I should be communicating those things continuously, not just in an annual review.
Yeah.
Right? So, because we don't have an option, like, I'd much rather, like, Sandra, if you were my boss, say, "Hey, Suzanne, I need you to actually work a little bit more on this area. I see that as an area for growth for you. Let's work out a plan. Come back to me with some action steps
Yeah.
on how you'd like to tackle that, and let's come up with something together." I so much more appreciate that in a conversation in a one-on-one, whether it's every other week, once a week, whatever that
Yeah.
cadence is, than walking into that conversation, "A year ago, you told me this, and you're not doing
Yeah.
this well." right?
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. And then,
No.
frankly, when we get down to the annual review and you haven't had those discussions, it's so hard to fill out the form, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the
Like,
worst. The worst.
what do I
The
need to
worst.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So,
I like to call that like the time warp that exists in this because there's so many aspects of business and life that are actually really continuous, like, and performance is one of them. And traditionally, we've had a tendency to treat them as one-offs, like this, like annual
mhm,
review, like it's like outside of your daily, grind or work. And what you're talking about here is that's really actually integrated, is actually a part of it. We're constantly zigzagging towards a path together. So that's what it's a little bit of my view on this challenge. And I totally agree with you. It has to be something that's just a part of regular work. And yes, it might need a formal structure to house it. But if you're just doing that annually, it's the worst. There's nothing else to say about it.
and then
Both,
I've walked
both
in a
ways. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've walked into situations where the department head has no idea who the person is or what they've done, and
Yeah.
they're just making something up about whatever, and I'm like, no, that is not actually accurate.
No, and or helpful, right? And that's like that stuff has to stop. The things that are not focused on the business, it's not directly impactful on that person, team, the organization. That's the things that have to evolve because there's no more time or room for these checkbox exercises really nowadays. So yeah, I yeah, I totally agree with that view. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne, for sharing yours. I can't love it when I'm surprised by, yeah, executive recruiter talking about structure, data, and clean data, and putting the business front and center at all times. So those are such great themes. And those are the ones I'm taking away from this conversation. Is there anything else I can ask you? Is there anything else that you wanted to share with the listeners on the topic? But I really,
Oh, I appreciate that. It was fun having this conversation, and looking forward to perhaps another one in the future.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
You're welcome.